This is new material from a new manuscript in progress. "So you're Sweetie, huh?" I muttered to myself. Sweetie, the behemoth. He moved with a distorted gait and swung at me. It felt like time had slowed as I watched the blades approach. It was a crude metal instrument, full of rusted, amber divots and deflections across its length, like it had been intentionally neglected. As Sweetie's stumpy arm accelerated toward me, I watched skittering insects crawling across crusty, maggot-infested flesh, pinched between strands of twine. His brutish, overflung motion had sealed his blade's trajectory, giving me ample reaction time. But Jess was about to be crushed by his oversized lump of a foot. I rolled forward, ducking around the blade, snatching the satchel, and opening its main pouch. "What now?" I asked. Jess's tiny black paws snuck onto the pouch's edge, his pointy ears pulled flat against his head. "Keep moving. Can't you help me?" "Not yet. It's too soon." I sidestepped, avoiding Sweetie's bum rush. I reeled at the stench of bad cheese as he passed. Peering into the pouch, I spotted Jess lying flat on his back, crouching as low in the satchel as possible. "What? Why?" "You'll see," Jess replied. His white claws glimmered as he pulled the pouch closed, disappearing behind the brown leather opening. Sweetie was having trouble turning about on legs that were different lengths, causing a severe teeter-totter limp. Sticking the ground with his weapon, he yowled and pivoted on the blade's tip. I could feel his pain in that moment. Sweetie was a giant simpleton. I could read it on his face and see it in his eyes. Becoming a mutilated brute with a rusty blade for a hand wasn't his choice. The pain of using his weapon had to be excruciating. I couldn't imagine using the diseased, rotting flesh of his arm for anything, much less fighting with it. A creaking, moaning sound, the turning of gears caught my attention, and I almost missed my cue to spin again. I'd been in many training fights, but this was too easy. Sweetie's lumbering was slow, and his swipes seemed to be more for show than harm. The swollen stump at the base of his blade was dripping, leaving a fresh trail of moist, brown spots in the dirt. I wasn't sure where to look in that moment. Sweetie was turning about again, grunting, with heaving breaths, while two other doors were opening on each side of me. A thick bale of short figures were emerging from the shadows. They appeared to be small men. Each had oversized noses and tall ears that stuck from the sides of floppy hats. Matching striped vests exposing sparse chest hair with thick ropes securing short daggers at their waists. None of them seemed to be motivated to enter the fight. They'd stopped just inside the arena floor, nodding at each other, then shaking their heads at me and Sweetie. "Well, go on then," shouted the wavy-haired man from the stands. The small men pulled daggers from their waists, raising them to their foreheads. They shouted in unison, "For Kirill! Get her!" I'd moved around Sweetie, putting him between me and the others. It was an odd scene, Sweetie in the middle with his rusty blade, and the waist-high men surrounding him. I paused, wondering who would get to me first, the behemoth Sweetie or the swath of tiny men. I wasn't sure if my curse could handle that many attackers, nor what would happen if they severed one of my limbs. Would it grow back? Or would I just walk around with a stump? I didn't think having a blade shoved into a stump of an arm was a good look, but at least mine would heal, unlike Sweetie's. I was spellbound by the scene and stood in a stupor, waiting to see what would happen next. "Arleia, snap out of it," Jess said. He'd popped out of the satchel's top. "Oh, now you're going to help," I asked. "Pick me up. Hold me at arm's length." I wasn't sure how holding Jess was going to help. Fumbling with his furry little body, I yanked him out of the satchel by his torso and held him out. I'd never seen a cat's face express frustration before, but he did it nonetheless. "Not facing you," Jess said. "Facing them. Turn me around. Then say what I say. Repeat after me. Shout at them." Jess was small enough that spinning him about was just a flip of the wrists. He screamed at the top of his lungs, mixing words in kitty roars. "I'm the spawn of the underworld with my powers. Meow, I'm cursing you with the hatred of 1,000 demons. Meow, you descend to hell and burn for eternity, you crusty little men." I repeated everything Jess told me to, doing my best to add violent inflection at the end. "Did you just say the meow parts?" "You told me to repeat what you said." "Yeah, but they can't understand me, so everything I say just sounds like cat noises to them." The small men and the lumbering behemoth Sweetie had skittered to a stop, forming a semicircle around us. I knew we looked ridiculous, with me holding a scrawny black cat at arm's length, meowing at them like a lunatic, and I can't imagine what they heard, but it bought us some time. I was beginning to think, Jess didn't have a plan. "Well, what do we do, meow?" I asked Jess. "Run for it. Those dwarves are faster than they look." I spun on my heels, tucked Jess under my arm, and ran. Creaking, moaning gears were chewing the doors closed, blocking the exits. SweePea was lumbering behind me, while the dwarves split in two, flanking my sides. I was approaching the wall and had nowhere to go. Jess, what do I do now? Throw me to the top of the wall, then jump up after me. At that moment, I thought Jess had lost his mind. The wall was more than twice my height and at least a full person taller than SweePea. With my adrenaline pumping, I threw Jess a bit too hard, and he soared high above the wall. I hoped he'd land on his feet, but there was no time to watch. With a clump of charging, shouting dwarves hot on my tail, I rolled to the side and kicked off the wall, rushing toward SweePea. I jumped, grossly underestimating my leg strength. Somehow the curse I carried sent me careening into the air. It felt like I'd taken flight until I arced back toward the ground, skidding to a stop on SweePea's other side. Brushing dirt off my shoulders, I pulled my sword, realizing that I might not be as vulnerable as I thought. Arleia, you can show off later. Get over here. If you want to get to Kirill, we need to go, like right now, Jess shouted. With my aerobatic jump, I'd put distance between myself and my entourage, but I needed to get back to Jess. Feeling emboldened by my newfound strength, I stood my ground. SweePea was the first to reach me, and I pivoted on my heels, curving my blade until it came whipping over his arm, meeting the crook of his elbow. A bounty of flies dispersed in a plume as his stumpy forearm flopped to the ground. My mind had dropped back into my weapons training as I completed the first attack. I focused, moving with grace like I was taught, but I wasn't through yet. I didn't want to overshoot SweePea's head, so I pumped my calves gently, popping into the air, swiping my blade at his throat. I had intended to let SweePea bleed out, but either my blade was too sharp or my swipe was too strong. Instead of splicing his arteries to drain his life's blood, his head sheared off, bobbling to the ground several paces away. By the time I landed, SweePea's noggin had settled on the base of his double chin. He had a confused look on his face, like he didn't notice his decapitation until his head came to a standstill. I felt relieved, knowing I'd done the behemoth a favor, for he no longer had to fulfill the life of a slave, nor contend with a rotting, maggot-ridden arm. I knew my reasoning was razor thin, but I needed some type of justification for killing him. SweePea's corpse dropped flat on its back, a poofy brown cloud masking the gore. I thought I would feel winded from my efforts, but instead I felt invigorated and energetic, ready for anything. The dwarves paused their thumping approach as I used SweePea's shirt to clean viscous residue from my sword. Muttering and pointing, the small men studied the stumpy head. The more weathered members of the group held the younger ones back, refusing to donate their kin to my blade. Jess had run around the perimeter wall, bellowing at me again. "Come on, we need to go." "Guards! Guards!" shouted the wavy-haired man. New faces were appearing in the Colosseum, emerging from multiple entrances across the seating area. Groaning metal, crunching gears, and rattling chains announced the reopening of the arena doors around me. I wanted to ask Jess why we couldn't just go through the doors at ground level, but I spotted a bevy of guards rushing toward me. I sheathed my sword, sprinted at Jess, and jumped. I had hoped to clear the top, but my timing was off, and I leapt too soon, smashing into the perimeter wall several feet below its top. Knocking the wind from my lungs, white spots appeared in my vision as I groped at the wall's top with my fingertips. While I crawled up, Jess crawled down, planting himself on my shoulder, digging his claws into my armor's thick leather. "Do as I say, and we'll reach Kirill's palace in just a few minutes." With a quick yank of my fingers, I was on my feet, juking across the Colosseum's aisles. I was surprised at my nimbleness, the fine motor skills and dexterity I'd developed since being burnt to a crisp back in Nadur. I felt the curse replenishing my energy as I moved. Following Jess's instructions, I blazed down a staircase and hopped out of an open window, reaching street level faster than I'd imagined. Dropping into a narrow row of merchants' shops, small carts jutted across my path. Beams of sunlight filtered through cloth sunshades, illuminating stone pavers in a kaleidoscope of colors. "Keep moving, walk casually," Jess said, but I was too stunned by the vibrant clothing, exotic fruits, and savory aromas to downplay my reactions. Passing a roasted pig caused me to yearn for something more substantial than scrawny field rabbit or a lump of fruit. I felt a pinch at the side of my neck. A tiny pinprick poked me in a tender spot. "They're staring at you. Look down. Move forward, swiftly," Jess prodded. "When you reach the end of this row, grab one of those linen sheets and duck around the corner." I hadn't noticed the attention I was garnering until that moment, but Jess was correct. Dozens of men dressed in familiar tight clothing, lumpy arms, and coiffed hair were eyeing me, while women were huddled in the backs of the shops, with their shoulders slumped forward, averting their eyes. Back in Nadur, I worshipped a goddess who believed in equality across all types. I was halfway to the end of the row when the first guards emerged from the Colosseum behind me. They shouted for me to stop, but I dashed away, snatching a colorful linen, ducking around the corner as Jess had instructed. Keep going, quickly now. I glanced over my shoulder and hurried forward, leaving the market. We had entered an area with narrow walkways and vertical buildings. Tiers of laundry held by thin lines protruded from tiny balconies. A gray-haired lady eyed me through striped underpants flapping from a clothes line. We turned 2 more times, curving and twisting around what I assumed was a residential area. Go right, up that alley. I turned again, climbing stairs that seemed to rise to the sky. Pull the linen over your shoulders, cover your armor. Run to the top of this stairway and turn left onto the next street. Tan bricks with tight mortar lines streamed by as I leaped upward, covering the steep incline 2 steps at a time. I wasn't sure if Jess knew where he was going or if he was just trying to make sure we'd escape the guards. I'd never encountered such tight spaces, narrow streets, and vertical multi-story buildings. I couldn't see the horizon, and the dark shadows between buildings made it difficult to know which way I was going. Reaching the top of the stairs, I turned the corner, and Jess's instructions continued. Now slump your shoulders, focus on the ground, untie your hair, and keep moving. The staircase I'd just scaled was at least 3 stories tall. It was a near vertical shot, straight up a steep hillside. My breathing was deep and heavy, but it lasted a mere moment compared to what I expected. I untied my hair and it flopped over Jess. Sitting on my shoulder, he looked more like a yellow-eyed hairball than a sleek black cat. I continued following Jess's instructions, slumping my shoulders and lowering my eyes. It made me feel dismissive and weak. I was a high priestess, the pride of Tithana's people. This behavior was contrary to everything I'd known. I paused to check for guards, but there were none chasing me. Looking downhill, I scanned the area below, retracing our escape. Hundreds of buildings were stacked in vertical layers between tiers of the city. Each level was linked by narrow staircases wrapping around the steep mountainside. The Colosseum I escaped was tiny in the distance. It was set at the city's bottom edge, near a wall that I assumed separated the farmers from the city folk. Tiny dots of white moved across a distant hillside. I imagined that from a shepherd's vantage point, Kirill's city looked like a wedding cake with rounded layers set in stair-stepping tiers. 1 more level to go, Jess said. Turn to your left. Dozens of glossy tiles, set in decorative patterns, passed underfoot before I realized I was treading across a mosaic. Beneath my feet, I spotted Kirill holding a silver sword, the sun blessing him in victorious golden rays as he stood atop a giant beast. He was depicted in muscular perfection, the epitome of manhood in every way. Locks of wavy hair dropped over wide, round shoulders. His rippling strength symmetrically flowed to a narrow waist and bulging legs. Jess, is this depicting one of Kirill's victories? Yeah, sure. He looks amazing. Uh-huh. Keep moving. We're looking for 1 more staircase going upward. Within 50 paces, I spotted a narrow path cut into the rock face. After a short climb, I emerged onto an enormous flat swath of ground with dark green grass so perfect it could have been sculpted in place. Pulling my gaze upward, my eyes traced over a polished tile path until I spotted white marble steps that wrapped around a huge atrium supported by thick pillars. I recognized the building from a painting and basked in the glory of Kirill's palace, feeling humbled in its presence.